Imagine waking up and it's 40 degrees below freezing. Not just for one day, for months at a time. There's no house, no heater, no warm blanket waiting for you. Just you, a few other people, and whatever you can carry. This was daily life for thousands of years during the last ice age. And somehow, our ancestors made it through. Not just survived, but thrived. They spread across entire continents in weather that would kill most of us in hours. So how did they do it? No modern fabric, no thermometers, no weather forecasts. Just knowledge, teamwork, and some incredibly clever inventions. That's what we're covering in this video. First, let's get something straight. The Ice Age wasn't one single freezing event. It was a long period of time with cycles of cold and slightly less cold, stretching back over 2 million years. Scientists call this the Pleistocene. During the coldest stretches, huge sheets of ice covered much of the northern world, ice sheets thick enough to bury entire mountains. So much water was locked up as ice that sea levels dropped. This actually opened up land bridges between continents, letting early humans walk into places they couldn't reach before. The last really intense cold stretch peaked around 20,000 years ago. Temperatures in some regions were far colder than anything most of us have ever felt. And humans weren't just surviving somewhere warm and waiting it out. Many groups lived right in the middle of it, close to glaciers, on open tundra, in bitterly cold grasslands. This is called mammoth steppe, and it stretched across huge parts of the world. Cold, dry, windy, but full of grazing animals. And where there were animals to hunt, there were reasons for people to stay. If there's one invention that made Ice Age survival possible, it's clothing. Not just wrapping an animal skin around your shoulders, real, tailored, fitted clothing. The breakthrough came with a tiny tool, the sewing needle. Carved from bone, sometimes no thicker than a matchstick, with a tiny hole at one end for thread. This simple tool appears in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, and it changed everything. With a needle, people could stitch pieces of hide together tightly instead of just draping loose skins that let cold air in. Thread came from plant fibers, sinew, or twisted strips of hide. Clothing was built in layers, just like modern winter gear. A soft inner layer of fur trapped warm air close to the body. An outer layer of tougher hide blocked the wind. Different animals were chosen for different jobs. Reindeer hide for warmth, fox fur for softness, tougher hides for boots. Boots were carefully designed too, insulated enough to keep feet warm but grippy enough on ice. Hats, mittens, and hoods completed the outfit, covering every part of the body that could lose heat fast. This wasn't guesswork, it was skill passed down and refined over generations, and it mattered enormously. Good clothing wasn't just comfort, it was the difference between life and death. And it made something else possible too. With clothing this advanced, people could move into colder places than ever before. Clothing had become a kind of portable shelter. The second essential tool was fire. Humans had been using fire long before the coldest parts of the Ice Age, but during this period, fire became absolutely essential. It wasn't just for warmth, though that mattered enormously. Fire let people cook meat that would otherwise be frozen solid. Cooking made tough meat easier to chew and digest. It also helped render fat down into a rich source of calories. Fat was incredibly valuable in the cold. It provided far more energy per bite than lean meat alone. And energy meant staying warm from the inside out. Fire also extended the usable hours of the day. During long, dark winters, that mattered a lot. People could keep working, making tools, repairing clothing after the sun went down. Fire also dried out clothing that got wet from snow. Wet clothing in freezing temperatures could be deadly, so drying gear by the fire wasn't optional, it was a nightly routine. And of course, fire kept predators at a distance too. Fire had to be carefully maintained, especially in a place with few trees. In open tundra, wood was often scarce, so people got creative about fuel. Dried animal dung, bones, and fat could all be burned when wood ran out. Bone actually burns surprisingly well once it catches, especially with a little fat. Keeping a fire going night after night took constant attention. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was some of the most important work there was. Fire and clothing weren't enough on their own. People also needed shelter. A lot of people picture Ice Age humans living deep inside dark caves, but that picture isn't quite accurate. Most people actually used rock shelters instead, shallow overhangs cut into cliffs or riverbanks with a protective wall of rock above them and behind them. These natural shelters were then improved. Large hides were draped across the open sides to block wind, turning an open rock face into a real weatherproof home. In places where good rock shelters weren't available, people built their own shelters from scratch. One of the most incredible examples comes from Eastern Europe, circular dwellings built entirely from mammoth bones. Mammoth skulls, jawbones, and tusks were carefully stacked and arranged to form a sturdy frame. Hides and turf were layered over the bones for insulation. Some of these structures are over 20,000 years old, and they show real engineering skill. Inside, a fire burned at the center of the space, providing warmth, light, and a place to cook. These shelters became more than just places to sleep. They were gathering places for talking, working, and telling stories, a warm, dry space in the middle of a frozen world. Staying warm in one place was only part of the puzzle. The other part was knowing when and where to move. Early humans weren't tied to one fixed location. Many groups followed the herds of animals they depended on. Reindeer, horses, and bison moved with the seasons, and humans moved right along with them. This meant always being close to a reliable food source instead of waiting for food to come to them. When conditions turned especially harsh, some groups retreated to milder pockets of land. Scientists call these areas refugia. Places like southern Europe and parts of the Iberian Peninsula stayed more livable even while the areas around them froze hard. These refuges became crowded with life during the coldest periods. More plants, more animals, more shelter from the wind. When the climate eased up again, people spread back out. This back-and-forth pattern repeated again and again over thousands of years as the climate cycled through cold and less cold. This flexibility was one of humanity's biggest advantages, being willing and able to move when the environment demanded it. Survival also depended on hunting, and Ice Age hunting was no small task. The animals of this era were often massive: woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant bison, wild horses. Some of these animals weighed many times more than a person. Hunting them required real strategy, not just brute force. Spears with sharpened stone points were the main weapon. Groups often worked together to drive animals toward a trap. Steep cliffs, narrow valleys, or soft ground worked well for this. In one famous hunting ground in eastern France, hunters lit fires to guide migrating herds into a narrow corral marked by a distinctive limestone landmark called the Roche de Solutré. Once trapped, the animals could be killed safely at close range. This same coordinated hunt happened here for tens of thousands of years. A successful hunt provided far more than just meat: hides for clothing and shelter, bones and antlers for tools, fat for fuel, food, and even waterproofing. Nothing from a successful hunt went to waste. Meat that wasn't eaten right away was preserved. Freezing cold temperatures actually worked in people's favor here. Meat could be buried in snow or frozen ground, turning the harsh cold into a natural freezer. This stored food became essential during the leanest, coldest stretches. None of this worked without good tools. Ice Age humans became remarkably skilled toolmakers. Stone blades, spear points, and scrapers were carefully crafted, often from materials like flint or obsidian, which could be chipped into extremely sharp edges. Scrapers were used to clean and prepare animal hides, removing fat and flesh so the hide wouldn't rot. This process took real skill and patience. Bone needles, as we covered earlier, made tailored clothing possible. Antlers and bones were shaped into other useful tools too. Owls for punching holes and tools for working wood. Even needles for a very specific job, making waterproof seams. A poorly sewn seam could let cold air and moisture in, so sewing skill was a genuinely valuable, respected ability. Toolmaking wasn't a one-person job either. Skills were shared and passed down within the group, each new generation building on what came before. No single person could handle Ice Age survival alone. It took a whole community working together to make it through each year. Different tasks were often shared between different people. Hunting large, dangerous animals was risky work, and it often fell to certain members of the group. Meanwhile, other important work kept the camp running, processing hides, gathering edible plants, and tending the fire. This kind of shared, complementary work kept the whole group stable, even when hunting was unsuccessful for a while. Other stored resources helped carry the group through. Children were taught skills early through watching and practice. Elders carried knowledge that younger members hadn't learned yet: which animals to hunt, which plants to gather, where to find water. This shared knowledge was, in a real sense, survival technology, just as important as any spear or piece of clothing. It's worth being honest here. Ice Age survival wasn't some smooth, guaranteed success story. Life was genuinely hard, and it stayed hard for a very long time. Food shortages happened. Sudden storms could trap a group far from shelter. Cold-related illness and injury were constant risks. Not every winter ended the same way for every group. Some communities struggled, and some didn't make it through especially hard years. That's part of why so much of this knowledge mattered so much. Every skill, every habit, every piece of shared knowledge improved the odds, but it never made survival automatic. The people who made it through these winters weren't simply lucky. They were resourceful, adaptable, and deeply connected to their environment. And every generation added a little more knowledge to what came before. Eventually, after thousands of years, the climate began to shift again. Temperatures slowly started to rise. This warming trend picked up around 12,000 years ago. Glaciers that had stood for thousands of years began retreating. Grasslands slowly gave way to forests in many regions. The mammoth steppe, once vast, began shrinking, and with it, some of the great herds began to decline too. This was a huge shift for people who had built their whole lives around the cold. Just as before, adaptability became the key to survival. Hunting strategies changed as animal populations shifted. Clothing and shelter styles slowly changed too, suited to milder conditions. The skills built during the coldest years didn't disappear though. They carried forward, shaping how people lived for generations after. So how did ancient humans survive the Ice Age? Not through luck and not through raw physical strength alone. It came down to clever, practical solutions. Tailored clothing that turned hides into portable shelter, fire that provided warmth, food, light, and safety, shelter that turned open rock and bone into a real home, the wisdom to move when the land demanded it, and the strength that came from working as a group. None of these solutions came easily. They were built slowly, tested by hard experience, generation after generation. And in the end, that knowledge helped humanity spread across the entire planet into places no other animal our size had ever managed to live. If you enjoyed this one, there's a lot more ancient history where this came from. Let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next, and I'll see you in the next video.